Okay, what frame rate should you use for YouTube? Okay, so first of all, what are you doing on YouTube? If you're just talking to the camera like this, I'm just going to give this recommendation. 24 frames per second. If you're doing slow motion stuff, you know, birds fly in slow motion, whatever in slow motion, you could shoot at whatever frame rate, depends on how slow you want it to be. If you want it to be really slow, the higher the frame rate, the better. But you got to actually slow it down to like a playback speed of, 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second. I would generally advise against 30 frames per second because from what I know, I saw somebody on YouTube not too long ago, I think, compare it to like soap opera TV. Like, when you see shows that are like straight to cable TV, but not in the sense of like really high quality shows, more like your kind of just daytime television that you maybe watch just kind of to fill time. And this might sound kind of savage, but it's like, you might not think of like soap opera TV as something that you might be super excited about watching. Maybe it is for you, right? Maybe that's your thing. But generally speaking, like soap opera TV might be considered a bit more corny, a bit more budget. Maybe you still like it and, whatever. But you know what I mean? If, what was it? If you want your footage to look more cinematic, it seems like the general consensus is that you're going to shoot at 24 frames per second. That's if you're on like an NTSC video format. If you're on a PAL, P-A-L, video format, you're going to shoot at 25 frames per second. NTSC and PAL is kind of a niche thing, but just essentially think like regions of the world. So if you're in North America, as far as I understand, you're usually going to be on NTSC shooting mode. If you're in more of a Europe area, you're more probably likely to be on a PAL shooting mode. Don't think of it anything beyond that right now unless you want to get more deep into your learning on that. But just essentially think, if you're in North America, you're shooting on NTSC mode, whatever, and so you're going to be shooting at 24 frames per second. That's what's kind of more considered like the cinematic frames per second, I think, in terms of like from what I've heard people say. Again, credit to all the people that have taught me things about this stuff, but like the 24 frames per second, depending on your shutter speed as well. Right now I have it in, I think, an automatic kind of exposure adjustment, so my shutter speed might not be at the recommended setting for cinematic quality, but 24 frames per second is going to help you to get apparently a more natural motion blur, similar to, I think, what we actually see with our eyes. At least I think that that's what I've heard. Credit to the people that have told me about this. And so if you want to do anything that's just like, talking head like this, I just recommend 24 frames per second. I'm probably going to generally advise against 30 frames per second because I think, as far as I would guess, or as far as I get the vibe of, it just doesn't look super great, But in some cases, maybe that's the look you're going for. But again, just in terms of vibes and stuff, if you want to go for more of a cinematic vibe, just go 24 frames per second. If you're shooting stuff in slow-mo and you want it to play back at a slow-mo speed in your video editing software, do whatever you got to do to slow it down by a certain percentage to make it play at like the 24 frames per second equivalent. Because like that's what makes it slow-mo, is when you take a high frame rate clip and you slow it down to like a 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, or basically any frames per second that is lower than the original frame rate that it was shot in. That's how the slow motion actually becomes slow motion, is you're taking the large frame rate and you're slowing it down to a smaller frame rate equivalent. Hopefully, does that make sense? Maybe that makes sense. Anyway, I'll leave that there. If you got any questions, I got a Skool Community, link in description. Feel free to join the Skool Community, ask some questions. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.